On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military offensive the world had ever seen up to that point, marking the beginning of Germany's invasion into the Soviet Union. This moment would prove pivotal in shaping the outcome of the Second World War. At first, the German forces swept across the vast Soviet landscape with overwhelming force. Panzer divisions tore through enemy lines, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, granting the Wehrmacht almost complete control of the air. Massive pockets of Soviet troops were trapped and annihilated in devastating encirclement operations. Victory seemed almost certain for the Germans. Another lightning conquest appeared to be within reach. However, the Red Army, though battered and bloodied, refused to collapse. Despite suffering staggering losses, the Soviet resolve endured. As the Germans pushed ever closer to Moscow, their momentum began to slow. The brutal Soviet Union terrain, the immense distances, and the unyielding resistance took a heavy toll. Just 20 miles from the Soviet capital, the tide began to turn. In a shocking reversal, the Soviets launched a fierce counteroffensive, catching the German forces off guard and driving them back. It marked Hitler's first major defeat on the battlefield in this global conflict. So how did such a meticulously planned campaign, one that came so close to success, falter at the last moment? To understand that, we must look at the origins of this colossal gamble. Hitler had been contemplating a strike against the Soviet Union as early as July 1940, even before the Luftwaffe's failed effort to subdue Britain. His ambitions went back even further, to the ideological foundations laid out in Mein Kampf during the 1920s. In Hitler's view, Eastern Europe was destined to become the Lebensraum, the vital living space, for a Germanic empire. It was here, on the vast plains of the East, that Hitler envisioned National Socialism proving its supremacy or collapsing entirely. The core belief behind this plan was that the Soviet system, weakened by internal repression and communist inefficiency, would not withstand a concentrated German assault. Hitler famously claimed that all it would take was one solid blow, kick in the door, as he put it, and the entire structure would fall. He envisioned a rapid, knockout blow, a campaign lasting no more than 2 months. The Wehrmacht had no appetite for a drawn-out war of attrition. Germany lacked the manpower and resources for such a prolonged struggle. To bring this vision to life, the Nazis mobilized over 3 million troops, assembling the most massive invasion force in history. The plan was grand in scale and relied on a coordinated attack by 3 massive army groups. Army Group North was to drive toward Leningrad. Army Group Center set its sights on Moscow, and Army Group South aimed to seize Ukraine and its resources. The strategy mirrored the blitzkrieg tactics that had brought swift victories in Western Europe. Rapid movement, overwhelming force, and psychological shock. Success meant not merely defeating the enemy in open battle, but paralyzing their ability to respond. When the operation began, everything went according to plan. The Soviet military, unprepared and still reeling from Stalin's brutal purges of its leadership, was thrown into chaos. German forces destroyed much of the Soviet air power while it was still grounded, granting themselves total aerial superiority. This allowed armored divisions to punch deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies before they could retreat. In contrast to the British and French in 1940, who at least attempted to fall back when threatened with encirclement, Soviet forces were often too slow, too poorly led, and too disorganized to escape. Entire Soviet field armies vanished, swallowed up in the chaos of battle. Yet, beneath the surface of these early victories, cracks were beginning to form in the German strategy. By the time they reached this point, Germany expected to have destroyed the Russian field armies, and that the remaining surge towards Moscow would be more of a parade than a battle. But the Germans had completely underestimated the size of the Soviet army. The Germans launched their massive invasion with close to 3 million troops, expecting the Red Army to field a similar number. However, by the end of 1941, despite having taken around 3 million Soviet prisoners, the Germans were still entangled in fierce battles. Their initial success came at a cost. The rapid advance of their armored divisions across the vast expanse of Soviet territory left them stretched thin, and supply lines became increasingly fragile. To their surprise, Soviet forces, far from collapsing, continued to resist with stubborn tenacity. This led to a dangerous situation behind the German front. Large Soviet formations that had been bypassed now posed a threat to German logistics, launching attacks on supply lines and disrupting communications. At this point, Hitler made a pivotal decision. Despite strong opposition from his senior commanders, he ordered Army Group Center to halt its push towards Moscow. Instead of pressing the advantage, the German offensive split its focus, redirecting forces both north and south to eliminate the remaining Soviet pockets. These brutal battles saw hundreds of thousands more Soviet troops either killed or captured, and by mid-September, the organized resistance in the field had largely been crushed, or so it seemed. With that, preparations resumed for the assault on Moscow. Yet this interruption proved costly. While the Germans took time to consolidate their rear and allow slower elements to catch up, the Red Army was far from idle. The Soviets used the breathing room to reorganize, rush reinforcements to the front, and carve out a new defensive perimeter around the capital. This fortified line now stood in the Germans' path, something they hadn't fully anticipated. But the challenges didn't end there. Despite being poorly equipped and hastily trained, fresh Soviet recruits kept arriving. British aid, too, was beginning to trickle in. Not in overwhelming quantities, but enough to make a difference. New divisions often lacked basic necessities. Some soldiers wore civilian coats instead of military uniforms, and rifles were so scarce that men had to share them. Still, it was something. From the northern ports of Murmansk and Archangel, the first Arctic convoys brought critical supplies, weapons, food, vehicles, giving Soviet forces just enough to stay in the fight. Meanwhile, the Soviet industrial machine, relocated far beyond German reach to the Ural Mountains, had begun to recover. Factories that once lay in the path of the Blitzkrieg were now churning out tanks, especially the formidable T-34, which started arriving in growing numbers at the front. And then came the Russian weather, which turned everything on its head. October brought alternating snow and thaw, transforming the heartland into a quagmire. Roads vanished under a sea of mud, and the German advance began to sputter. With supply lines faltering and resistance stiffening ahead, their momentum collapsed. By the time they reached within 20 kilometers of Moscow, winter had truly arrived. It was no ordinary winter. It was the brutal, unrelenting Russian kind. By late November, frostbite had put more German soldiers in hospital beds than bullets had. Though Operation Barbarossa had stalled, Germany still appeared to hold a strong hand across the Eastern Front. Army Group North believed Leningrad was on the verge of surrender. Army Group Center stood poised at the outskirts of Moscow, and Army Group South had secured vast swaths of Ukraine, including the capital, Kiev. As 1941 drew to a close, German command prepared for what they assumed would be the final blow to the Soviet Union once the winter passed. But they were unaware that the Soviets had been quietly preparing a decisive move of their own. In a strategic masterstroke, the Red Army redeployed a significant number of divisions from the Far East, previously stationed along the Siberian border facing Mongolia and the Japanese. Soviet intelligence had confirmed Japan would not launch an attack, allowing Stalin to shift these well-equipped and battle-ready units westward. These weren't fresh conscripts or hastily assembled militia. These were hardened divisions, many drawn from the unforgiving wilderness of Siberia. Accustomed to freezing temperatures, they came dressed in proper winter camouflage, armed with weapons that wouldn't fail in sub-zero conditions. The German forces they would face were in stark contrast, fatigued, underdressed, and wholly unprepared for the brutal Russian winter. On December 6, 1940, the Red Army struck back with ferocity. Their counteroffensive, unleashed just outside Moscow, caught the Germans off guard and sent them reeling. What had begun as a blitzkrieg now turned into a desperate retreat. The dream of a quick, decisive conquest disintegrated before the Wehrmacht's eyes. Hitler's belief that Soviet resolve would crumble under pressure proved disastrously wrong. Instead of collapsing, the Soviets absorbed the blow and transitioned the conflict into one of endurance and industrial might. Barbarossa, once envisioned as a lightning campaign, now mutated into a drawn-out war of attrition fought deep within Soviet territory, under snow-covered skies. The German military, stretched thin and short on both manpower and resources, found themselves trapped in a conflict for which they were ill-prepared. Even with the failure to knock the USSR out of the war in 1941, the Nazi regime was not ready to abandon its ambitions. The following year, under Hitler's personal command, Germany shifted its focus. Rather than renewing the push toward Moscow, which his generals advised, Hitler directed the offensive southward, toward the oil-rich Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad. He understood, perhaps more clearly than his military staff, that this was no longer just a contest of tactics, but a war governed by raw materials and production power. Whether he liked it or not, Hitler now grasped the brutal truth. Victory would depend not on swift advances, but on who could endure the longest.